I modified a couple of old Deluxe Innovations woodchip hoppers and built removable loads for them. And in this video I'll show how I did it. I had bought two different types of the woodchip hoppers. The variant with the deep side ribs had little notches at the top of the sidewalls. I think they were intended for a woodchip load insert. I was planning to build my own load inserts, so the little notches had to go. I cut strips from 0.75mm styrene in order to use them as plugs. I cut the strips way too large for the notches to make them easier to handle. Then I glued the strips into the notches with regular plastic cement. When the cement had cured, I simply cut away the excess material and shaved the styrene flush to the sidewalls. A common problem with these cars are the warped sidewalls that make it hard to either fit loads into the cars or make it hard to remove the loads once they're in. In order to straighten the sidewalls, I used 12mm or half-inch plywood and added cardboard strips on both sides until the sidewalls looked reasonably straight. Don't add too many cardboard strips. It's better to leave a little bit of an inward bend than to make the cars too wide by accident. Trying to fix that can quickly turn into a mess. The next step is applying heat to make the plastic take the new shape. I used hot water fresh from my electric water kettle in a container and dipped the cars into the water for about 30 seconds. This technique only works well for bending the sidewalls to the outside. Trying to fix sidewalls that turned out too wide easily ends in an unrecoverable mess. Getting the cardboard wet during the procedure might cause it to swell up, so better avoid that too. The water becomes too cold quickly and is hot enough for about 2 cars in a row. I had seen in several prototype pictures that cars of this type had cross-bracing at the top of the sidewalls. I wanted to add this detail to my cars to make them look closer to the prototype and to add rigidity to the structure to avoid more warping in the future. The bracing was cut from brass 1mm by 0.6mm L profiles. 17.4mm seemed to be a good length for the cross-bracing. I cut the brass profile a bit longer and then filed the sections to the correct length, repeatedly test-fitting them until I could wedge them into the car without the sidewalls bending out. I used quick curing 2-component epoxy adhesive to glue the cross braces into the cars. Toothpicks worked great for applying the glue. It's also important to check that the cross braces are properly squared up against the car. Excess glue can be filed away after the glue has fully set. These models ride too high and as a result, the top of the cars end up too high relative to other models. Fortunately, the plastic car body makes it easy to file down the bolsters. As soon as the area without paint stops being circular, it's time to stop. I also converted the cars to body mount couplers. I used Microtrains 1015 couplers and the Microtrains tap and drill set to prepare the mounting holes on the cars. The car variant with the deep side ribs has rectangular molded on pads that I think are meant to help with coupler mounting, but actually interfere with the Microtrains couplers. However, these are easy enough to remove with a sharp hobby knife and a file. The screws that come with the couplers are too long, so I shortened them with wire cutters. Since the car body is plastic, it's very easy to over-torque the screws and strip the threads in the mounting holes, but the material is still strong enough to secure the couplers. For extra peace of mind, I secured the coupler boxes with a small amount of CA glue. I reused the trucks that came with the cars by snipping off the truck-mounted couplers. I also replaced the wheel sets with 36-inch metal wheels from Fox Valley models. Now it was time to start working on the load inserts. The car bodies have been straightened out, but each of them is still slightly warped in its own way and the cross braces have been glued in by hand. This means that every load insert needs to be built to fit a specific car. I built the load inserts from 0.75 and 1mm thick styrene sheets, that's 30,000ths and 40,000ths of an inch. I started with 5mm and 10mm wide strips from the 0.75mm thick styrene that I glued on top of each other to form the backbone of the load insert that would later rest on top of the cross braces of the cars. The exact measurements don't matter too much, but they do determine the overall shape of the load later. I originally tried to have a single 10mm wide strip of the 0.75mm styrene resting on top of the cross braces, but felt the resulting load insert was a little bit too flimsy. I then used the 1mm thick styrene to build the parts of the load insert that would sit between and below the cross braces. To do so, I measured the space between the cross braces, which turned out to be 35mm for me, and cut a long 35mm wide strip from my larger styrene sheet. Then I cut 14mm and 17mm wide segments from it. I chose the 14mm width according to my taste, and the 17mm width was a good fit for the inside width of the woodchip hoppers. The 14mm wide segments formed the next level down. I glued one of them in place and then waited for the plastic cement to set before gluing the second one. It's important to make sure that the backbone of the load doesn't sit at an angle relative to the car body at this step. Now it is the first time to make sure that the load insert fits in between the cross braces. A small file works great to make the required adjustments. After that, I cut shorter segments off the 14mm strips to form the load insert toward the car ends. I just eyeballed the required length and usually used whatever scrap pieces had piled up in the meantime and had the vaguely correct size for the job. After the glue set, it was time again to bring out the file to make sure the clearances are correct. Developing a good eye for the required clearances when gluing the styrene strips in place does help to cut down on the amount of filing that needs to be done. The final layer were the 17mm strips. I started gluing one of the center segments first and then basically repeated the steps from the last layer to get a good fit. This layer does have the added difficulty that it needs to conform to the car body itself. I turned the load insert around frequently to make sure that it will fit into the car in either orientation. When I was happy with the fit, I filed down the edges of the styrene strips to reduce the steps between the layers a bit. With the work on the car bodies and the basic load inserts done, I airbrushed the inside of the cars. To protect the outside, I taped the top of the sidewalls before spray painting a mix of mostly Tamiya XF53 neutral grey with a couple of drops of XF64 red-brown. While airbrushing the inside, I decided to spray paint the undercarriage and the trucks with the same mixture to save me a bit of work when weathering later. Then I applied the base paint to the load inserts. I used an old Tamiya spray paint rattle can that I had laying around. I think anything beige is good enough. Applying the base paint makes the load inserts a little bit larger, and painting the insides of the cars also threw off the fit as well, so a quick round of filing and test fitting is in order, before moving on to add the actual woodchip load to the insert. I had tried to use actual wood filings first, but getting hold of a sufficient amount of fine enough wood filings turned out to be too time consuming for my taste. Wood filings also change color when exposed to the air over time. After a bit of experimentation, I settled on a two-layer approach. First a layer of N-scale ballast and then a layer of very fine HO scale sand. I painted undiluted matte medium onto the load inserts to secure the first layer of N-scale ballast. For this layer, I focused on the outer edges of the load inserts. When that was dry, I applied undiluted matte medium to the entire load insert and used a sieve to apply the HO sand. The undiluted matte medium will not be enough to properly secure the sand, so I soaked everything with a 50-50 mix of matte medium and water. I also added a tiny amount of soap to the mix. I waited overnight to make sure that everything is properly dry before continuing. There will be some buildup of material around the edges, so I used a file to remove the excess and get a good fit in the car again. The next step was painting the load to a color appropriate for wood chips. After some experimenting, I settled on a mix of 1 ml XF2 flat white, 10 drops XF78 wooden deck tan, 2 drops XF3 flat yellow, 5 drops XF53 neutral grey and 1 drop XF64 red brown and thinner to taste. The mix seems to be very sensitive to the amount of yellow, so if in doubt, try with less yellow first. When the paint had dried, I removed the excess paint around the edges and checked the fit again. As the final step, I marked each load with the reporting number of the car it was for. And after a little bit of weathering, my fleet of woodchip hoppers was finally ready for service. That's all for today. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. See you next time.